Today is all about cortisol. Now, it tends to get talked about as though it is something that you would be better off without, something bad. But that isn't quite right, because if you didn't have any cortisol in your body, you would be incredibly unwell. You probably wouldn't survive the day you need it. The difficulty with cortisol is a bit more subtle, and it's that your stress system was built for a threat lasting just a few minutes, whereas a lot of you are carrying pressure that, let's be honest, it lasts years, doesn't it? So today we're going to work through 6 things together. We're going to talk about what cortisol does when it's behaving itself, what changes when the stress never stops, the signs to look out for, why your sleep sits right in the middle of all of this, how movement and food really does change the picture, and then finally, the part that happens inside your own head. Now, for context, I spent about a decade in emergency medicine in the NHS, seeing the end result of these sorts of problems that have been building for decades before anybody noticed them. And stress really is a big part of that picture. My name is Dr. Alex, and before we get into the video today, let me just mention that I have now started a daily newsletter that goes out every single morning. It is just a short one that I write while I'm drinking my coffee in the morning. Sometimes a practical tip, sometimes a bit of research that I think you might find useful, and sometimes just whatever I've been thinking about but will absolutely help you with your health journey. It takes about a minute to read every morning. It's not that lengthy, it is fairly easy on the eye, and it costs absolutely nothing at all. And plenty of you actually have already joined. I've mentioned this just a couple of times, and we've already got over 1,000 of you in our community, and that is amazing. So I really hope you find it useful, and let's carry on with the rest of the video. So the first what cortisol is actually for thing to talk about is what cortisol does when everything is working properly as it should. So cortisol is a hormone, and a hormone is simply a chemical messenger that is made in one part of the body and tells other parts of the body what to do. Now, hormones can act fairly quickly within a few minutes or fairly slowly across days and weeks, unlike your nervous system, where electrical signals travel down your nerves in just a fraction of a second. So, you move your hand off something really hot before you've even thought about it. That sort of reflex. Cortisol is made in your adrenal glands, which are these 2 small glands sitting on top of your kidneys in your lower back. And the thing is, it follows this really important daily pattern. It climbs in the early hours while you're asleep. It peaks about half an hour after you wake up, and then it drifts down very gradually to its lowest around midnight when you're fast asleep. Now, that morning rise actually is pretty important. That is what we want. That is part of what gets you out of bed, because cortisol releases stored sugar from your liver. And since you haven't eaten anything overnight, that is your body's sort of own way of protecting your brain, which needs a very steady supply of energy, and it just cannot go without it. So that is an important mechanism that literally keeps you alive. It also holds your blood pressure steady when you stand up. And in the short term, it helps to calm down inflammation by telling your immune cells to quieten their inflammatory signals, which is why steroid medicines are essentially man-made versions of it. When something alarming happens, like a car pulling out in front of you, or the phone going off at 2 in the morning where you think it's one of your family members in trouble, adrenaline arrives within seconds, and then cortisol follows a few minutes behind, releasing energy so that you can deal with that problem. So cortisol isn't really the problem here, and the trouble starts when the system that makes it never really gets to switch off. The next thing to what changes when the stress doesn't stop understand is why stress carrying on for months does something different to stress lasting minutes. So what actually happens is a chain of signals starting in a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which sends a message to your pituitary gland just beneath it, which then signals through your bloodstream to your adrenal glands, and then they release the cortisol, and we call that chain the HPA axis, and basically stands for the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis to 3 parts in that order. Now, the useful thing is that this system has a built-in brake, because once cortisol is circulating, it actually travels back to the brain and then tells it to stop sending the signal. A bit like a thermostat switches the heating off once the room is warm, like until it's, reaches a certain temperature, like 21 degrees. But the proper name of that arrangement in your body is called a negative feedback loop. In a very short and sharp stress environment, that system works exactly as designed. You get a rise, you deal with the thing, the brake comes on, and within an hour or so, you are back to where you started. Nice and calm. But if that signal keeps arriving day after day after day after day, the part of the brain meant to hear that stop message basically just become less responsive to it. Now, my nan, well before she died, she had a garden that backed onto the railway line. So the trains went past literally around 50 meters from her kitchen window. And as kids, we would, stick our fingers in our ears and then run back inside every time a train came past because it was so unbelievably loud. But it never bothered her at all because she'd stopped hearing them years before because she got used to it. So that is what happens to your bra system. So you end up producing more cortisol while listening to it less. Well, the signs that tend to show up next thing to talk about is what this actually looks like from the outside. Now, this doesn't obviously happen to everybody, but these are the common signs that cortisol could be part of the picture, and they're what we often see in people who have been under some enormous pressure for years, whether that's financial or work or family, relationships, whatever. The first cygnus weight settling around the middle, while their arms and legs stay pretty much the same, and that is because cortisol nudges up your fat storage towards the deeper fat around your organs, which we call visceral fat. And that fat is unusually rich in the receptors that cortisol acts on. The next is blood sugar drifting upwards. And the test for that is HbA1c or A1c, which gives you an average blood sugar reading over the previous 3 months reported in millimoles per mole in the UK and as a percentage in the US. After that, then your blood pressure can creep up year on year. And also there's an immune side to this as well, where people pick up every bug, cough and cold going around. Now let me just be really clear and address something that somebody asked in the comments a couple of weeks ago. So I said that cortisol calms down your inflammation, and it does in short bursts. Over years, though, your immune cells stop responding to it properly in the same way that your brain stopped responding. So you get the worst of both with low-level inflammation simmering away throughout your body, what we call chronic low-grade inflammation, and also less protection when you meet an actual infection. And finally, the last sign that people might notice from the outside is a change in your sleep. Your sleep habits and perhaps your mood as well, of feeling or looking really tired and perhaps getting a bit more grouchy and irritable as well. So falling into bed exhausted and then waking up at 3 or 4 in the morning, or finding that you've got a bit of a shorter fuse these days. You've got a bit of a temper problem perhaps. Now obviously all of those things are pretty vague. They all overlap with other things including an underactive thyroid or a low iron level or sleep apnea as well when we talk about the sleep problems, and also menopause as well. So if any of them sound like you, then that is a conversation to have with your GP or your primary care doctor to exclude other things and investigate what the cause could be. So let's talk about why sleep sits in the middle of its sleep in a bit more detail then. Short sleep, where you're sleeping, a short number of hours, like 4 to 6 hours a night, or it's very much interrupted. This changes the shape of your entire hormonal day. There is a very well-known trial published in The Lancet that showed this very, very clearly, and I'll put a link in the description below for you. So the researchers took 11 healthy young men and restricted them to 4 hours in bed per night for 6 nights in Arrow. So 4 hours of sleep for pretty much a week. They then compared that against a recovery stretch where the same men had 12 hours in bed per night, also for 6 nights. So then 4 hours and then 12 hours. And they measured 2 things. They measured glucose tolerance, which just means how quickly your body clears sugar from the blood after eating, and then also cortisol across the entire day. Now, when these men were down to 4 hours a night, they cleared sugar from their blood noticeably more slowly, and that even in cortisol, which ought to be sliding downwards towards its overnight low, this was actually raised instead, and it was falling far more slowly than it should. And that is really worth paying attention to, because these were not unwell people. They were fit men in their 20s, and it took just 6 nights to make a difference to their blood sugar and their cortisol levels. Now, the research team in this study said that the pattern that we saw in these people resembled what you'd expect in somebody decades older. So, in under a week, these healthy young men were handling sugar more like somebody in the early stages of a blood sugar diagnosis, like type 2 diabetes. And it also runs in both directions. Since a raised evening cortisol makes it harder to drop off to sleep, and then poor sleep pushes your evening cortisol up again. So, it's almost like a lose-lose situation. Your body clock takes its cue from light, but also from consistency, which is why a steady wake time and then 10 minutes of daylight in your eyes as soon as you wake up or as early as you can. This does more than anything you could ever attempt at 11 at night to help you get to sleep. We're almost religious about it. Well, we were before we had our baby. But you should try and become an expert sleeper. So instead of being tempted into watching another episode on Netflix, decide that you're going to be going to bed at 9 every single night and then wake up at 5 or 6 in the morning. So a good 8 or 9 hours, and hold that for a month. You will notice a real difference, and I think you'll enjoy your days a lot more than you did staying up late in front of the telly. Now, the how movement and food change. The picture next thing to cover is exercise. And there is a puzzle in this because a single hard workout really does push your cortisol up. So that sounds like a bit of a contradiction, doesn't it? And yet, people who train regularly are calmer people and they generally handle stress a lot better. The answer is in your recovery afterwards. Your body copes perfectly well with cortisol going up as long as it comes back down properly afterwards. And it's that rise and fall repeated that trains the system to switch off quickly. Training hard without a recovery period is where it all goes wrong because cortisol never fully comes back down and you end up with this long-running pattern that we've just been describing. Now, I've trained with a lot of people preparing for Ironmans and ultramarathons over the years, and the ones who went really hard every single day without any proper recovery, they usually just got ill in the end. They had to take a couple of weeks off completely and then came back less fit than before. So what works looks fairly ordinary. Walking or cycling or doing something aerobic most days at a pace where you could still hold a conversation. 2 sessions a week of some sort of strength work, ASA minimum, and then some harder effort saved for the days when you've actually slept properly and you feel like really pushing yourself, like some intervals or, a park run on I think it's a Saturday these days, just a fast 5K where once a week you test yourself and see if your time has improved. And the thing is, going for a 10-minute walk after something stressful has happened, like you've received an email from your boss or you've had a bit of an argument with your friend, this is really worth a lot more than it sounds because it uses up the energy that has just been released into the blood. Now, food obviously sits in the same territory since your blood sugar swinging up and down and drinking too much and skipping meals and living on coffee all add their own load to a system that is already pretty busy. Now, the part that happens in your head, the last thing to talk about all about cortisol is the mental side of it. Because a stressful event on its own doesn't keep your cortisol up for very long and it's going back over it afterwards, sort of ruminating on it that does the damage. So just say you've had a difficult conversation at work with somebody, it's finished by 10 in the morning, but you're still turning over on the drive home and then again at midnight struggling to sleep. And as far as your body's concerned, that is the same event happening again and again and again. Ruminating or stewing on something, like this, like a stressful conversation. This is, in all intents and purposes in terms of your body, this is a physical event, not only a mental one. And it's how a difficult 20 minutes becomes a difficult 6 months. Now, I am, as I mentioned before, a bit of an overthinker myself. So I'm not standing on any high ground here. The thing is that what reliably settles my head, well, one, it's exercise, getting out with Mango and, into the fresh air, whatever the weather, but also talking it through out loud with Steph, rather than just sort of thinking about it on my own. I'm a big believer that a problem shared is a problem halved. So if you're struggling with something, just getting it out to somebody, doesn't matter who it is, more often than not, it will help you. And the thing is, that isn't a soft point either, because studies on social contact suggest that being with somebody you trust really does blunt the stress response that your body produces. Slow breathing helps as well, particularly making the exhale, the outbreath longer than the IMB breath, or the inhale for a couple of minutes. Now, a lot of you will have seen cortisol tests and cortisol lowering supplements advertised probably on this video. I have no control over the ads that are placed on my video, so it really wouldn't surprise me. But it's worth going through where the evidence sits on these sorts of things. Now, the saliva tests that you can order online, I wouldn't recommend them. These are really hard to interpret because cortisol swings hour by hour anyway, so it depends when you actually do that test. Now, adrenal fatigue, which is something that gets bounced around a lot with these supplements, this isn't really a recognized medical diagnosis. And a systematic review where they pulled together all of the studies on a question and then assessed them together. They went through dozens and dozens of studies on this and found no consistent evidence that adrenal fatigue actually exists. Now, the supplement evidence obviously is pretty thin, so with something like ashwagandha, you're looking at small, short trials showing pretty modest changes on stress questionnaires, which doesn't really come close to sleeping properly. Basically, forget these supplements that are all about cortisol and stress, and just do the things that the research points to all the time. So, social contact, sharing your problem with somebody else, talking it out, exercise, and also eating anti-inflammatory foods, whole foods, and trying to get away from ultra-processed stuff, because there is tons of research that this really helps with stress as well. Now, none of this is about removing stress from your life, because that isn't on offer for most people. We cannot really change our workplace that easily. Yes, you could leave the job, but it's not realistic for a lot of people. You can't change your family. There are so many causes of stress that really a lot of people cannot touch. What you're after is giving the system time to switch off in between. And the things that help, like I've just said, are just the ordinary things. Sleep obviously comes first because it's what resets the daily cortisol rhythm. Movement and activity comes next since it burns off the energy that stress releases, and it teaches your system to settle back down afterwards. Steadying your blood sugar really helps as well, because every big blood sugar spike and swing is another demand on the same system. And talking things through with somebody that you trust and feel safe with, it breaks the cycle of going over it in your head, which is what keeps cortisol raised between these events. So I hope you found this video useful. It was a bit of a quick skip over cortisol. I didn't really go into that much detail because I know that you guys like shorter videos like this rather than half an hour or 40 minutes. But do let me know if you want me to go into a bit more detail in a future video and any other things you want me to focus on. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you're all doing well. Thank you for all the support you give me on this channel, and I'll see you next